Even before the match was struck, I saw a dark body lying across the passage. A dead man, I guessed instantly. "Why, no," said Sapt, striking a light. "A dead dog, Fritz." An exclamation of wonder escaped me as I fell on my knees. At the same instant Sapt muttered, "Ay, there's a lamp," and stretching up his hand to a little oil lamp that stood on a bracket, he lit it, took it down, and held it over the body. It served to give a fair though unsteady light, and enabled us to see what lay in the passage. "It's Boris, the boar hound," said I, still in a whisper, although there was no sign of any listeners. I knew the dog well. He was the king's favourite, and always accompanied him when he went hunting. He was obedient to every word of the king's, but of a rather uncertain temper towards the rest of the world. However, de mortuis nil nisi bonum, there he lay, dead in the passage. Sapt put his hand on the beast's head. There was a bullet hole right through his forehead. I nodded, and in my turn pointed to the dog's right shoulder, which was shattered by another ball. "And see here," said the constable, "have a pull at this." I looked where his hand now was. In the dog's mouth was a piece of grey cloth, and on the piece of grey cloth was a horn coat button. I took hold of the cloth and pulled. Boris held on even in death. Sapt drew his sword, and inserting the point of it between the dog's teeth, parted them enough for me to draw out the piece of cloth. "You'd better put it in your pocket," said the constable. "Now come along." And holding the lamp in one hand and his sword, which he did not resheathe, in the other, he stepped over the body of the boar hound, and I followed him. We were now in front of the door of the room where Rudolf Rassendyll had supped with us on the day of his first coming to Ruritania, and whence he had set out to be crowned in Strelsau. On the right of it was the room where the king slept, and further along in the same direction the kitchen and the cellars. The officer or officers in attendance on the king used to sleep on the other side of the dining room. "We must explore, I suppose," said Sapt. In spite of his outward calmness, I caught in his voice the ring of excitement, rising and ill repressed. But at this moment we heard from the passage on our left, as we faced the door, a low moan, and then a dragging sound as if a man were crawling along the floor, painfully trailing his limbs after him. Sapt held the lamp in that direction, and we saw Herbert the forester, pale faced and wide eyed, raised from the ground on his two hands, while his legs stretched behind him and his stomach rested on the flags. "Who is it?" he said in a faint voice. "Why, man, you know me," said the constable, stepping up to him. "What's happened here?" The poor fellow was very faint, and I think wandered a little in his brain. "I've got it, sir," he murmured. "I've got it fair and straight. No more hunting for me, sir. I've got it here in the stomach. Oh, my God!" He let his head fall with a thud on the floor. I ran and raised him. Kneeling on one knee, I propped his head against my leg. "Tell us about it," commanded Sapt in a curt, crisp voice, while I got the man into the easiest position that I could contrive. In slow, struggling tones he began his story, repeating here, omitting there, often confusing the order of his narrative, oftener still arresting it while he waited for fresh strength. Yet we were not impatient, and heard without a thought of time. I looked round once at a sound, and found that James, anxious about us, had stolen along the passage and joined us. Sapt took no notice of him, nor of anything save the words that dropped in irregular utterance from the stricken man's lips. Here is the story, a strange instance of the turning of a great event on a small cause. The king had eaten a little supper, and having gone to his bedroom, had stretched himself on the bed and fallen asleep without undressing. Herbert was clearing the dining table and performing similar duties, when suddenly, thus he told it, he found a man standing beside him. He did not know he was new to the king's service who the unexpected visitor was, but he was of middle height, dark, handsome, and looked a gentleman all over. He was dressed in a shooting tunic, and a revolver was thrust through the belt of it. One hand rested on the belt, while the other held a small square box. "Tell the king I am here. He expects me," said the stranger. Herbert, alarmed at the suddenness and silence of the stranger's approach, and guiltily conscious of having left the door unbolted, drew back. He was unarmed, but being a stout fellow, was prepared to defend his master as best he could. Rupert, beyond doubt it was Rupert, laughed lightly, saying, "Man, he expects me. Go and tell him," and sat himself on the table, swinging his leg. Herbert, influenced by the visitor's air of command, began to retreat towards the bedroom, keeping his face towards Rupert. "If the king asks more, tell him I have the packet and the letter," said Rupert. The man bowed and passed into the bedroom. The king was asleep. When roused, he seemed to know nothing of letter or packet, and to expect no visitor. Herbert's ready fears revived. He whispered that the stranger carried a revolver. Whatever the king's faults might be, and God forbid that I should speak hardly of him whom fate used so hardly, he was no coward. He sprang from his bed. At the same moment the great boar-hound uncoiled himself and came from beneath, yawning and fawning. But in an instant the beast caught the scent of a stranger. His ears pricked, and he gave a low growl as he looked up in his master's face. Then Rupert of Hentzau, weary perhaps of waiting, perhaps only doubtful whether his message would be properly delivered, appeared in the doorway. The king was unarmed, and Herbert in no better plight. Their hunting weapons were in the adjoining room, and Rupert seemed to bar the way. I have said that the king was no coward, yet I think that the sight of Rupert, bringing back the memory of his torments in that dungeon, half cowed him, for he shrank back, crying, "You!" The hound, in subtle understanding of his master's movement, growled angrily. "You expected me, sire," said Rupert, with a bow. But he smiled. I know that the sight of the king's alarm pleased him. To inspire terror was his delight, and it does not come to every man to strike fear into the heart of a king and an Elphberg. It had come more than once to Rupert of Hentzau. "No," muttered the king. Then, recovering his composure a little, he said angrily, "How dare you come here?" "You didn't expect me?" cried Rupert, and in an instant the thought of a trap seemed to flash across his alert mind. He drew the revolver halfway from his belt, probably in a scarcely conscious movement, born of the desire to assure himself of its presence. With a cry of alarm, Herbert flung himself before the king, who sat back upon the bed. Rupert, puzzled, vexed, yet half amused, for he smiled still, the man said, took a step forward, crying out something about Rischenheim. What, Herbert could not tell us. "Keep back!" exclaimed the king. "Keep back!" Rupert paused. Then, as though with a sudden thought, he held up the box that was in his left hand, saying, "Well, look at this, sire, and we'll talk afterwards." And he stretched out his hand with the box in it. Now the king stood on a razor's edge, but the king whispered to Herbert, "What is it? Go and take it." But Herbert hesitated, fearing to leave the king, whom his body now protected as though with a shield. Rupert's impatience overcame him. If there were a trap, every moment's delay doubled his danger. With a scornful laugh he exclaimed, "Catch it, then, if you're afraid to come for it!" And he flung the packet to Herbert or the king, or whichever of them might chance to catch it. This insolence had a strange result. In an instant, with a fierce growl and a mighty bound, Boris was at the stranger's throat. Rupert had not seen, or had not heeded, the dog. A startled oath rang out from him. He snatched the revolver from his belt and fired at his assailant. This shot must have broken the beast's shoulder, but it only half arrested his spring. His great weight was still hurled on Rupert's chest and bore him back on his knee. The packet that he had flung lay unheeded. The king, wild with alarm and furious with anger at his favourite's fate, jumped up and ran past Rupert into the next room. Herbert followed. Even as they went, Rupert flung the wounded, weakened beast from him and darted to the doorway. He found himself facing Herbert, who held a boar spear, and the king, who had a double-barrelled hunting gun. He raised his left hand, Herbert said. No doubt he still asked the hearing, but the king levelled his weapon. With a spring, Rupert gained the shelter of the door. The bullet sped by him and buried itself in the wall of the room. Then Herbert was at him with the boar spear. Explanations must wait now. It was life or death.